Okay, hi Sec3s. In this screencast, I'm going to go through the source-based question scale of assessing purpose of the different sources you're going to get. This isn't something unfamiliar to you as you have already covered this in Sec2 history, okay? But what this screencast will do is to give you a revision of this particular SBQ skill. Okay, so by the end of the screencast, you'll be able to identify the factors that affect a source's purpose. You're able to think about the source's context, and finally, based on all these components, you'll uncover the purpose of a source, okay? So please make sure that you follow this screencast with the worksheet that you've been given, okay? There will be some blanks, some keywords for you to fill in. So as you go through the video, please make sure you fill in the necessary blanks, okay? So firstly, just a recap, what's a motive or a purpose? Okay, so we know that a purpose is basically the writer's reason or objective for creating the particular source. When we look at the source, the first thing we should ask is, why has this source been created? Okay, and sometimes the reason is not so obvious, sometimes it's quite hidden. So we basically need to read the source very carefully before we, excuse me, identify the real reason behind the creation of the source. Okay. So what do we need to consider in order to find out about a source's purpose? Okay, so how do you think we can uncover the purpose of a source? Okay, so you might want to pause this video here and just think for a while and maybe write some of your ideas in the box on the worksheet. Okay. So for example, if you see this poster of Adolf Hitler, ask yourself, why was this source created? Okay. Okay, so essentially, when we think about a source's purpose, when we want to uncover a source's purpose, you can ask the following question. So firstly, what does the source say? Okay, this is very important to know. So what is its message, for example? Another thing we can consider is, when was the source produced? Because this will give us an idea about why it's produced or it was produced. Where was it published, for example? Was it published in a newspaper, a government magazine, government broadcast, for example? So the place where the source is published affects its purpose. Also very important is who, right? Who created or wrote this source? This is central to determining, why the source was created in the first place. And finally, the situation or context or problem, perhaps. So what was happening at that time that led to this source being created? So for example, if the source is a speech, what was happening during that time that made the speaker make this particular speech? Okay, so these are some aspects that we can think about as we uncover the purpose of a source. So this particular writing frame, the Pavamo plus details and explanation, is something that you've been exposed to at lower secondary history, okay? So essentially, the P stands for problem or context. So what you need to do is to use your knowledge and think about the circumstance or situation that made it necessary to produce such a source. For example, you can read the background information that usually begins the source-based case study. So this gives you an idea of, what the situation was at that time, okay? And then the V stands for verb. So is it to convince or persuade, the audience? So the audience is very important. So who is this source trying to influence? Okay, because the source is trying to influence also determines what the source is trying to say. And then centrally, the message. So what's the source trying to tell you? So the content of the source. So how do we determine the message of the source? Is to look for evidence or details within the source itself. So having looked at the source or read the source very carefully, what is the author or the speaker trying to say? What message is he or she trying to convey? And finally, outcome. So having listened or having read this particular message, what is the source trying to achieve? What is it trying to get the audience to do? So the outcome should always be framed as a response, an action response from the audience, okay? So be careful. So make sure your outcome is always linked to the audience that you have identified. And finally, you need to quote relevant source details and explain them in relation to the message. So these are your details plus a short explanation. So this suggests that something, okay? So this is the writing frame that you learn to use in lower secondary history, and it's something that you'll continue to use for social studies. And remember that your per vamo must be phrased as a reason, okay? Because the question is a why, so your answer must be phrased as a reason in response to the why question. Okay, so as the example, we're going to look at this particular pictorial source, okay? So you can pause here if you want to really study the details of the source, okay? So the question is, study this source, source F. Why do you think this cartoon was published? Explain your answer. Okay, so this is a cartoon that appeared on a popular Singapore blog. Essentially, the context right behind this cartoon was the government, the Singapore government, was planning to basically demolish part of the Bukit Brown Cemetery. Okay, so essentially, what is this cartoon trying to say about this government's planned decision to demolish this Bukit Brown Cemetery? And if you know, Bukit Brown Cemetery is a place that contains a lot of historical graves, okay, a lot of Chinese graves from the past. Okay, so what is this source trying to say? Is it supportive of the action, the proposed action, or is it opposed to the proposed action? So how do we determine the message of the source? So firstly, we need to look at the source details. Okay, so you look carefully, it says, oh, eviction order. And who is it trying to evict? Clearly the dead people, right? People who've been buried in this particular cemetery. So rest no more, move. It all sounds very harsh, right? Very cold. Trying to get them to relocate, getting the dead people to relocate. Okay. And then it also says here, Daddy, why does the government insist on, okay, sorry, let me try to get rid of this. Yeah, why does the government insist on bulldozing natural environments like this? Okay, so wow, bulldozing, right? Again, another strong word that's being used, okay? It's a natural environment. And then it also says the government does not like old things that bring no value, tearing down and building new ones, bring them profits. Okay, so it's about, bringing them money. Okay, so what is the source trying to say about the government's proposed demolition? Okay, so you can pause here and think a little bit about the message of the source before moving on with me. Okay. So basically, having thought more clearly about the source, let's look at the different components again. So, what is the problem or context? Okay, so what was the situation that caused this source to be produced? So clearly, it was the government's planned removal of the Bukit Brown Cemetery. Okay, so essentially this cartoonist, having heard about the planned removal of the Bukit Brown Cemetery, felt very worried that this decision by the government would be accepted without question. So he's a bit worried. That's why he produces this source to get people to think a little bit more about the government's decision. So the verb could be convince, persuade, but who is the audience? So we can find out, there's a clue here, right? The popular Singapore blog. So read this thing called The Provenance carefully. Okay, so this provenance sometimes gives us a hint with regard to where the source was published, when it was published, and who it was published for. So who is the audience? Okay. So clearly Singaporeans or readers of this particular blog. Okay, because in a Singapore blog. So M stands for message. So what message is it trying to convey? So simply that the removal of the Bukit Brown Cemetery is not justified, okay, or is wrong, because it's for profits or economically motivated, right, which is what the source is trying to say. Or you can also say perhaps that, oh, it's unjustified because it disrespects heritage and the environment, right? Bulldozing natural environment, right? Telling graves to relocate themselves. These are very disrespectful actions, okay? And finally, what is the intended outcome? So having read or having studied this particular cartoon, what does the cartoonist want to achieve? What does he or she want the audience to do in response? Okay, so remember the outcome must be phrased as a response. So clearly you can say that in order to get the blog readers or in order to get Singaporeans to oppose the removal of the Bukit Brown Cemetery or protest against the removal of the Bukit Brown Cemetery. Okay, so these are the various components that you need in your answer. So this is the Pavamo that we've been talking about, the Pavamo frame. So having looked at the writing frame, so if you turn with me to the last page, you'll see this writing frame. So what you can do is to fill in these different components in the blanks or on the lines that have been provided, okay? So look at the writing frame carefully, and as you read the whole writing frame as a whole, you realize that it is phrased as a reason, one complete reason that responds to the question why. So just a quick recap to end this particular screencast. Firstly, what are the factors that help us to contextualize the source and help us to uncover the purpose? So we know that we need to know the time when the source was produced, the creator who produced the source, the situation or the context of the problem that led to this source being created, and the place, where was it created, where was it published, for example. So when we think about the source's purpose, we should think of its audience, so who it's produced for, the message, what is it trying to convey, and the intended outcome, which is a response from the audience. Okay, so I hope this screencast has been useful in helping you revise how to approach purpose questions in source-based case studies.